October 23, 1944, 12:32 in the morning. The Palawan Passage, a narrow corridor of dark water between the Philippine Islands. Commander David McClintock, captain of the USS Dace, pressed his eye against the periscope eyepiece and felt his heart stop. Through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by pale moonlight, he counted the silhouettes. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The entire center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy steaming directly toward him. McClintock's hands trembled slightly as he rotated the periscope. This was Admiral Takeo Kurita's force, the most powerful surface battle group Japan had assembled since Midway. Their destination, the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf, where General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines was being fulfilled with 200,000 American troops vulnerable on the shore. McClintock keyed his radio, knowing the transmission would reveal his position. Contact report. Multiple enemy capital ships, course 040, speed 15 knots. This is going to be big. He had no idea he was announcing the largest naval battle in human history, a 4-day cataclysm that would involve over 200,000 sailors, 282 ships, and rewrite every assumption about naval warfare. What followed would be so massive, so complex, so utterly without precedent, that it would be fought as 4 separate battles across 100,000 square miles of ocean. Before it ended, the sea would literally catch fire, the age of the battleship would die in flames, and the Japanese Navy would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. This is the story of Leyte Gulf, where desperation met industrial might, where Bushido faced pragmatism, and where the ocean itself became a killing field so intense that American sailors would have nightmares about it for the rest of their lives. To understand what happened at Leyte Gulf, you have to understand what brought the Japanese to this point. By October 1944, Japan's strategic situation was catastrophic. They had lost the Marianas, cutting their supply lines to the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. Their carrier force, once the most powerful in the world, had been gutted at the Philippine Sea in June. American submarines were systematically destroying their merchant fleet, strangling the home islands. But Japan still possessed a powerful surface fleet. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, mounting 18.1-inch guns that could throw a shell weighing as much as a car over 26 miles. They had heavy cruisers, destroyers, and enough fuel for one major operation. The Japanese High Command, led by Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, devised a plan so audacious it bordered on suicidal. Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. The premise was simple in concept, but breathtakingly complex in execution. Use Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, now nearly empty of planes, as bait to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. While Halsey chased the decoy carriers north, 3 separate Japanese surface forces would converge on Leyte from different directions, break through the relatively weak escort carrier groups, and annihilate the American transports and landing ships. If successful, MacArthur's invasion force would be cut off, destroyed, and the American advance would be delayed by months, perhaps years. It was a plan born of desperation, requiring perfect timing, complete surprise, and the willingness to sacrifice Japan's last carriers. Admiral Takeo Kurita, a 55-year-old veteran who had survived more battles than he could count, commanded the center force. His flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago, led a formation that represented Japan's last hope for a decisive surface engagement. Kurita was a careful, methodical commander, not given to reckless gestures. That he was willing to lead this mission told everyone involved how desperate Japan's situation had become. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded the Southern Force, a smaller group built around 2 old battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso. Nishimura was the opposite of Kurita, aggressive, confident, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. His force would transit the Surigao Strait and attack Leyte from the south. A separate, smaller force under Vice Admiral Kyohide Shima would follow Nishimura, providing support. Finally, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Northern Force, built around 4 carriers with only 116 aircraft between them. Ozawa knew his role. He was the bait, the sacrifice, the decoy that would draw Halsey away. It required him to make his carriers visible while remaining just out of reach, until Kurita and Nishimura had time to reach Leyte. It was a mission that demanded Ozawa deliberately lose his ships. He accepted without hesitation. The American forces were divided into 2 major commands. Admiral William Halsey commanded the Third Fleet, built around Task Force 38's fast carriers. Halsey was aggressive, impulsive, and obsessed with destroying the Japanese carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor. His critics called him reckless. His admirers called him bold. Everyone agreed he was dangerous when he smelled blood. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, responsible for supporting MacArthur's ground operations. Kinkaid's force included 6 battleships, all survivors of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt and thirsting for revenge, and 3 groups of escort carriers, small flat tops designed for ground support rather than fleet actions. The escort carriers were slow, lightly armed, and considered no threat to heavy warships. This division of command would prove critical. Halsey reported to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii. Kinkaid reported to MacArthur. There was no unified command, no single authority to coordinate their actions. This gap in the chain of command would nearly lead to catastrophe. The battle began in darkness on October 23rd, when 2 American submarines, USS Dace and USS Data, detected Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage. Commander David McClintock on Dace and Commander Bladen Claggett on Data had been patrolling together, a wolf pack hunting in the confined waters west of the Philippines. The contact report McClintock transmitted alerted the entire American command structure. Kurita's force was coming, and it was massive. But the submarines weren't content to merely report. In the pre-dawn darkness, both boats manoeuvred into attack position. At 05:25, Data fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Kurita's flagship. 4 hit. The Otago, one of Japan's most powerful cruisers, took catastrophic damage. Fires erupted throughout the ship. The engine rooms flooded. Within 18 minutes, she rolled over and sank, taking 360 men with her. Admiral Kurita was forced to swim for his life. He was pulled from the water by a destroyer, soaked, exhausted, and temporarily out of communication with his force. While Otago died, Data shifted targets to the heavy cruiser Takao, putting 2 torpedoes into her stern, crippling her steering and forcing her to withdraw with destroyer escort. Minutes later, Dace caught the heavy cruiser Maya, hitting her with 4 torpedoes. Maya exploded in a massive fireball, her magazines detonating in a blast that killed 336 men. She sank in less than 8 minutes. In 20 minutes, the American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers and crippled a third, forcing the Japanese admiral to swim for his life and throwing the entire center force into confusion. It was the most successful submarine attack of the Pacific War, and it was just the opening act. Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato and pressed on. He had no choice. The operation depended on precise timing. Every delay gave the Americans more time to prepare, but the submarine attack had revealed his position. The Americans knew he was coming. On October 24th, the battle entered its second phase as American carrier aircraft found Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. What followed became known as the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, though it was less a battle than a sustained execution. Wave after wave of American aircraft, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers descended on the Japanese formation. Their primary target quickly became apparent: the battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, the second largest battleship ever built, displacing 73,000 tons, and believed by the Japanese to be unsinkable. The Americans would spend the entire day proving otherwise. The first wave arrived at 10:30. Musashi's massive anti-aircraft battery opened fire, her 18.1-inch guns firing special beehive rounds filled with incendiary tubes designed to create aerial minefields. It looked impressive but proved largely ineffective against the swirling American aircraft. Torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the wave tops, while dive bombers attacked from above, splitting the Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The first torpedoes hit Musashi's port bow, massive underwater explosions that tore open her hull plating. The battleship shuddered but maintained formation, her damage control teams rushing to contain the flooding. She had been designed to survive this. Her builders had anticipated multiple torpedo hits, incorporating extensive compartmentalization and redundant systems. At 12:07, the second wave arrived. More torpedoes slammed into Musashi's port side. More bombs crashed through her deck armor. Fires started in multiple locations. The battleship began to list, flooding slowly, pulling her down by the bow. Still, she steamed on, her guns continuing to fire, her engines maintaining speed. The third wave arrived at 13:30, focusing entirely on Musashi. By now she was wounded, sluggish, her list increasing despite counter-flooding efforts. Torpedoes struck her starboard side, evening out the list but increasing the overall flooding. Bombs penetrated her deck, starting fires in her superstructure. Her speed dropped to 16 knots. The fourth and fifth waves came in the afternoon. By 15, Musashi had absorbed an incredible punishment. Estimates vary, but she had taken at least 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes, more than any battleship in history. Her bow was completely submerged. Her forward turrets were underwater. Still, she refused to die. Rear Admiral Toshihei Inoguchi, her captain, refused to abandon ship even as the list increased to 30 degrees. Her crew fought to save her, pumping water, fighting fires, trying desperately to keep her afloat. At 19:15, with the list exceeding 30 degrees and her forward deck completely submerged, Inoguchi finally gave the order to abandon ship. At 19:35, Musashi capsized and sank, taking Admiral Inoguchi and over 1,000 crew members with her. She had absorbed more damage than any warship in history, but American industrial might, in the form of over 250 aircraft sorties, had proven that no ship was unsinkable. Kurita watched Musashi die and made a decision that would be debated for decades. He reversed course, steaming west, away from Leyte. American pilots reported this to Admiral Halsey, who concluded that Kurita had been defeated and was retreating. This assumption would prove nearly catastrophic. While Kurita dealt with air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea, Admiral Nishimura's southern force was approaching Surigao Strait, the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. Nishimura knew it was a trap. The strait was narrow, confined, perfect for an ambush, but his orders were explicit. He was to force the strait and attack at dawn. Waiting for him was every American admiral's dream. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had 6 battleships deployed in a line across the northern exit of the strait. 5 of them, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Their crews had been training for this moment for 3 years. Revenge was about to be served. Oldendorf had arranged a perfect ambush. Destroyers and PT boats were positioned in the strait to make torpedo attacks. Cruisers flanked the battleships. At the strait's exit, the battleships waited in line, their guns loaded and ready. Nishimura would have to sail directly into this gauntlet, and there was no way to surprise it or outmaneuver it. At 22:36 on October 24th, American PT boats made contact with Nishimura's force. The small motor torpedo boats made several attacks but scored no hits, their small torpedoes ineffective against the battleships, but they reported Nishimura's position, course, and speed. The trap was set. At 03 Cairn on October 25th, American destroyers began their attacks. The destroyer Melvin fired torpedoes at Nishimura's flagship, the battleship Yamashiro. The torpedoes missed, but other destroyers found targets. The battleship Fuso took 2 torpedo hits and slowed, beginning to fall behind. The destroyer Yamagumo was hit and exploded, sinking almost immediately. But Nishimura pressed on. He had come too far to turn back, and his orders demanded he attack at dawn. His courage was unquestionable. His judgment was suspect. At 03:50, Fuso, struggling with her torpedo damage, suffered a catastrophic explosion. Her magazines detonated, breaking the battleship in half. Both sections remained afloat, burning furiously, lighting up the strait like torches. Nishimura didn't even slow down. With Yamashiro and 1 heavy cruiser still combat effective, he steamed directly toward Oldendorf's battle line. At 3:51, the American battleships opened fire. West Virginia, equipped with the most modern fire control radar in the fleet, fired first, her 16-inch guns sending shells the size of Volkswagens downrange. At a range of 22,800 yards, over 12 miles, her first salvo straddled Yamashiro. The second salvo hit. What followed was the last battleship action in naval history, and the only time one battle line crossed the T of another, the ultimate tactical achievement in surface warfare. Oldendorf's 6 battleships poured fire into Nishimura's force at a rate that defied comprehension. West Virginia alone fired 93 16-inch shells in the battle. Tennessee fired 69. California, the last Pearl Harbor battleship to return to service, fired 63. The other battleships added their fire along with 8 cruisers and dozens of destroyers. The volume of fire was so intense that spotters couldn't identify individual splashes. The ocean surface around Yamashiro erupted in a forest of shell splashes. Yamashiro took hit after hit. Her superstructure was shredded. Fires erupted throughout the ship. Her forward turrets were knocked out. Her bridge was destroyed. Admiral Nishimura was killed by shell fragments, dying on his flag bridge as his ship was battered to scrap. Still, Yamashiro tried to fight back, her remaining guns firing toward the American line, but she was outgunned, outranged, and doomed. At 04:19, after taking at least 12 major caliber hits and multiple torpedo strikes, Yamashiro capsized and sank. Only 10 men from her crew of 1400 survived. The heavy cruiser Mogami, burning and crippled, tried to escape south. She was caught by American aircraft at dawn and finished off. Admiral Shima's force, following behind Nishimura, arrived to find the strait filled with burning wreckage. He took one look at the situation, decided discretion was the better part of valor, and withdrew. He was criticized for this, but he was also the only Japanese admiral to survive the night with his force intact. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the most one-sided naval engagement of World War II. The Americans suffered minor damage to one destroyer and fewer than 40 casualties. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, and 4 destroyers, with over 4,000 men killed. Pearl Harbor had been avenged. While Oldendorf was annihilating Nishimura in the south, Admiral Halsey was falling for Admiral Ozawa's trap in the north. Ozawa had been trying desperately to get Halsey's attention all day on October 24th, sending his pitifully small air groups to attack American carriers, using every trick to make his presence known. Finally, late in the afternoon, American search planes found Ozawa's carrier force. Halsey took one look at the contact report and made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Japanese carriers, the same type of ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were within range. Every instinct Halsey possessed screamed at him to attack. Intelligence suggested these carriers were empty or nearly so, but Halsey didn't care. Carriers were the primary threat. Carriers had to be destroyed. He would take his entire force north to engage them. Staff officers tried to warn him. What about Kurita's center force? The pilots had reported it turning around, steaming back east towards San Bernardino Strait. Shouldn't someone watch that strait? Halsey was adamant. The center force had been beaten up by air attacks all day. It had lost Musashi and turned away. It was no longer a threat. The carriers were the priority. At 20 on October 24th, Halsey took Task Force 38, all of it, 60 ships including 6 fleet carriers and 8 fast battleships, and steamed north after Ozawa. He left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. No battleships, no cruisers, no destroyers. Nothing but open water between Kurita's center force and the American landing beaches. What Halsey didn't know, what his pilots hadn't reported clearly, was that Kurita had reversed course again. After steaming west for several hours, Kurita had turned back east, transited San Bernardino Strait in the night, and was now steaming south along the coast of Samar Island. Between Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers, and the American landing beaches at Leyte, stood only Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 was not designed for surface combat. The escort carriers displaced 7,800 tons each, 1/10 the size of Yamato. They carried aircraft designed for ground support, not anti-ship attack. Their maximum speed was 17 knots. Kurita's battleships could make 27 knots. Sprague's entire force carried 5 5-inch guns, weapons suited for anti-aircraft work, not fighting battleships. The Japanese center force mounted 18.1-inch and 14-inch guns that could destroy an escort carrier with a single hit. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surprised. October the 25th, 06:45. Admiral Sprague was on the bridge of his flagship, the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, drinking coffee and watching his carriers launch the morning's first ground support missions for the troops on Leyte. The weather was perfect. Tropical sun burning off the morning haze, light winds, calm seas. One of his radar operators called out a contact. Ships at 20 miles closing fast. Sprague assumed they were friendly. Halsey's force returning from the north, perhaps. Then the lookout spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. Sprague stared in disbelief. He grabbed his binoculars. Through the lenses he could see them clearly. Battleships. heavy cruisers, coming straight at him at high speed. At 06:58, the Japanese opened fire at maximum range. The first salvo fell short, but geysers of water erupted near the escort carriers, coloured by dye markers. Red, green, yellow, purple splashes, each Japanese ship using different colours to spot their fall of shot. Sprague grabbed the radio. Send to all ships, enemy battleships and cruisers 15 miles astern, request immediate assistance. Then he did the only thing he could do. He ordered his carriers to turn east, away from the Japanese, to launch every available aircraft and to make smoke. What followed became known as the Battle off Samar, and it remains the most incredible surface action in US Navy history. A grossly outmatched American force, through courage, desperation, and sheer audacity, would fight the most powerful surface force Japan had fielded since Midway to a standstill. Sprague's escort carriers couldn't outrun the Japanese battleships. Their 17-knot maximum speed was 10 knots slower than Kurita's ships. They couldn't outgun them. Their 5-inch guns were toys compared to 18.1-inch rifles. They couldn't hide. They were on open ocean in daylight. All they could do was fight and pray. Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, tiny ships displacing less than 2,000 tons each, to make torpedo attacks against the Japanese battleships. It was a suicide mission, and every skipper knew it. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer Johnston, didn't even wait for orders. At 06:50, before Sprague issued his command, Evans turned Johnston directly toward the Japanese fleet and charged. Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,500 tons, armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. She was attacking a force that included the battleship Yamato, which outweighed Johnston by a factor of 30. Evans didn't care. Over the intercom, his voice was calm. All hands to general quarters. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Johnston raced toward the Japanese line at flank speed, her 5-inch guns opening fire at maximum range. Her shells were too small to seriously damage a battleship, but they forced the Japanese to maneuver, disrupting their gun solutions on the carriers. At 7,000 yards, suicidally close for a destroyer engaging battleships, Johnston fired all 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, then turned hard to avoid the massive shells falling around her. 1 torpedo hit Kumano, blowing off her bow. The heavy cruiser slowed and fell out of formation, mission killed. Then the Japanese found Johnston. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck her bridge, killing 3 men and wounding Evans severely. Shrapnel tore into his left hand, 2 fingers and his thumb hanging by skin. He wrapped the mangled hand in a handkerchief and continued commanding from the shattered bridge. More shells hit Johnston, knocking out her engine room, slowing her to 17 knots, destroying her aft gun mount. She was dying, but she kept fighting, her remaining guns firing continuously at every Japanese ship that came in range. The other destroyers followed Johnston's example. The destroyers Howell and Heermann charged with Johnston, all 3 making torpedo runs against impossible odds. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler and Raymond joined the attack, their smaller guns barking defiance at ships 5 times their size. Commander Amos Hathaway, captain of the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, addressed his crew over the intercom. "Men, we're going in. The outcome is doubtful, but we're going in." It was the understatement of the war. Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., was a destroyer escort, even smaller and more lightly armed than a full destroyer. She carried only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes. Against her were battleships with armour thicker than Sammy B.'s entire hull. Hathaway didn't hesitate. Sammy B. charged directly at the battleship Congo, firing her 3 torpedoes at point-blank range, then continuing to close while her 2 5-inch guns fired as fast as the crews could load. The gunners on Sammy B.'s forward mount fired 324 rounds in the battle, so fast the barrel began to swell from heat. When the barrel could no longer be elevated hydraulically, they operated it manually, cranking the gun into position for each shot. Sammy B.'s shells, far too small to penetrate battleship armour, nonetheless hit Congo's superstructure, knocking out fire control stations and forcing the battleship to turn away. Then the Japanese landed their counterblow. A 14-inch shell weighing over 1 to 400 pounds struck Sammy B in the engine room. The explosion killed everyone in the space instantly and opened a hole in the hull large enough to drive a car through. Sammy B lost all power, dead in the water, helpless. More shells hit her. The forward gun mount was destroyed. The aft mount took a direct hit. Fires erupted throughout the ship. Her hull was so perforated with holes she looked like a sieve. Commander Hathaway, badly wounded, gave the order to abandon ship. At 09:10, Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank. She had lasted 1 hour in combat against forces designed to fight other battleships. Out of 224 crew, 89 were killed. The survivors spent 2 days in shark-infested waters before rescue. While the destroyers and destroyer escorts made their suicidal attacks, the escort carriers fought for survival. Their only weapons were their aircraft, whatever planes were in the air or could be launched. The aircraft weren't equipped for anti-ship combat. They carried light bombs and rockets designed for ground support. Many carried only machine gun ammunition. It didn't matter, they attacked anyway. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led a group of FM-2 Wildcats from the carrier White Plains against the Japanese battleships. His aircraft carried only machine guns. He made repeated strafing runs against Yamato's bridge, his .50 caliber bullets unable to penetrate the armor, but forcing the ship's officers to take cover, disrupting fire control. Other aircraft dropped depth charges, designed for submarines, on the battleships. The charges did almost no damage, but the Japanese hadn't been attacked this way before and treated each drop as a potential bomb, maneuvering violently. Torpedo bombers from the carriers made dry runs, approaching as if carrying torpedoes, forcing the Japanese ships to turn away even though the aircraft were unarmed. The American aviators were making it up as they went along, using psychological warfare and sheer bravado in place of proper weapons. One Avenger pilot, having exhausted his ammunition, continued to make diving attacks on a Japanese cruiser, forcing it to maneuver before landing on one of the escort carriers to rearm. He took off again immediately and resumed attacking. The entire battle became a swirling confusion of desperate maneuvers, smoke screens, rain squalls, and increasingly aggressive Japanese cruisers closing on the escort carriers. The carrier Gambia Bay, slowest of the escort carriers, fell behind and was caught by Japanese cruisers at 8:50. Shell after shell struck the small carrier. 8-inch armor-piercing rounds punched through her unarmored hull like paper. Her engine rooms flooded. Fires spread throughout the hangar deck. At 9:07, Gambia Bay capsized and sank, the only US carrier sunk by surface gunfire in World War II. The other escort carriers were being hit. Kalinin Bay took 13 hits but remained afloat. Fanshawe Bay, Sprague's flagship, was hit by multiple shells. White Plains took near misses that flooded compartments. The Japanese were closing in, victory within reach, and then, inexplicably, they turned away. At 09:25, with American carriers under his guns, with victory minutes away, Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to break off and withdraw. Sprague couldn't believe it. The Japanese battleships, which had been closing for the kill, turned north and steamed away. The Americans had won, not through superior firepower or tactics, but through sheer desperate courage that convinced Kurita he was facing a far more powerful force than reality. Kurita later claimed he believed he was fighting Halsey's fleet carriers, not escort carriers. He worried about fuel, about air attacks, about being cut off. The real reason may be simpler. His force had been under continuous attack for days. They had lost Musashi, survived endless airstrikes, fought through the night. His sailors were exhausted, his officers overwhelmed. The ferocious American resistance, the suicidal destroyer attacks, the constant air harassment had convinced Kurita that pressing on meant the destruction of his entire force. He blinked. He turned away. He gave up victory. Taffy 3 had sacrificed the destroyer Johnston, destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and carrier Gambia Bay. The destroyer Hall had also been sunk in the initial phase of the battle, and the destroyer Heermann was badly damaged. Over 1,000 American sailors died in the battle, but they had stopped the most powerful surface force Japan could field, with nothing but courage and desperation. Years later, Admiral Sprague would say, "The failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattacks, the volume of fire by our escorts, and the definite partiality of Almighty God." While Taffy 3 was fighting for survival, Admiral Halsey had found Ozawa's carriers 300 miles to the north and was systematically destroying them. The battle off Cape Engaño was less a battle than an execution. Halsey's 6 fleet carriers and 8 fast battleships overwhelmed Ozawa's 4 carriers with their pathetic air groups. At Oitzist on October 25th, American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's force. Wave after wave of Hellcats, Helldivers and Avengers descended on the Japanese carriers. The carrier Chitose was hit by multiple torpedoes and sank at 09:37. Zukaku, last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, took multiple bombs and torpedoes, capsizing at 14:14. The light carriers Zuiho and Chiyoda were also sunk. Ozawa's sacrifice was complete. He had successfully lured Halsey north, drawing the American fleet away from Leyte Gulf exactly as planned. That his sacrifice nearly led to disaster at Samar was something neither Ozawa nor Halsey had anticipated. At 10:00, Halsey received desperate messages from Taffy 3, enemy battleships attacking escort carriers. Request immediate assistance. Halsey couldn't believe it. Kurita was supposed to be defeated, retreating. But the messages were genuine, increasingly frantic. Halsey was 300 miles away, far too distant to help. He had fallen completely for Ozawa's trap, and American sailors were dying because of it. Halsey turned south with his battleships, racing to support Taffy 3, but by the time he arrived the battle was over. Kurita had withdrawn. Halsey's critics would argue for decades that he should have left his battleships at San Bernardino Strait. That splitting his force was basic tactical doctrine. That his obsession with the Japanese carriers nearly led to catastrophe. Halsey's defenders pointed out that he had destroyed the last of Japan's carriers, that Taffy 3 had held, and that aggressive action was preferable to caution. The debate continues to this day. By the evening of October 25th, the 4 days of battle were essentially over. The Japanese had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 12,000 Japanese sailors were dead. Their fuel reserves were exhausted. Their ammunition was depleted. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. American losses were significant but replaceable. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort sunk. Approximately 3,000 sailors killed. Within weeks, new ships would replace the losses. Japan would never recover. But the battle introduced a new horror that would haunt American sailors for the rest of the war. On October 25th, 5 Japanese Zeros, specially modified and flown by volunteers, deliberately crashed into American escort carriers. These were the first organized kamikaze attacks, and they were devastatingly effective. The escort carrier St. Lo took a kamikaze hit on her flight deck. The aircraft penetrated to the hangar deck where its bomb and remaining fuel exploded, triggering secondary explosions among armed aircraft and stored ammunition. Within minutes, St. Lo was consumed by uncontrollable fires. At 11:25, her magazines exploded, breaking the ship in half. She sank within 20 minutes, taking 114 men with her. The carriers Suwannee, Santee, and Kitkun Bay were also hit by kamikazes and damaged. The psychological effect was profound. American sailors had faced bombs and torpedoes throughout the war. They understood those threats, could defend against them, but suicide attacks, pilots deliberately crashing into ships, was something beyond their experience. It wasn't just an attack, it was a statement that Japan would sacrifice everything, every pilot, every plane, every ship before surrendering. The kamikaze would become the dominant Japanese tactic for the rest of the war, sinking dozens of American ships and killing thousands of sailors. It was Japan's final argument, a desperate weapon born of impossible odds, and it would make the Pacific War's final year the bloodiest for the US Navy. The Battle of Fier, Leyte Gulf, broke Japanese naval power forever. After October 1944, Japan's surface fleet rarely sortied. They had no fuel for operations, no trained pilots for their remaining carriers, no realistic chance of victory in a fleet action. The few ships that survived Leyte spent the rest of the war either in port or being sunk piecemeal by submarines and air attacks. Yamato, the great battleship that had survived Leyte, would sortie one final time in April 1945, sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa, with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. American carrier aircraft would find her and spend 2 hours turning the most powerful battleship ever built into an underwater wreck. But Leyte Gulf's true significance went beyond ship counts and casualties. It proved that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. Japan's admirals had designed an intricate, complex plan requiring perfect timing and execution. The plan had largely worked. Halsey had taken the bait. Kurita had reached Leyte Gulf. But American industrial might, represented by the swarms of aircraft, the endless replacements, the overwhelming firepower, made Japanese tactical success irrelevant. The Americans could absorb losses that would cripple Japan. They could make mistakes, like Halsey going north, and still win through sheer mass. This was the lesson of Leyte Gulf. In a war of attrition, industrial capacity determined outcomes. Japan's beautiful ships, her well-trained crews, her elaborate tactics, none of it mattered against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The survivors of Taffy 3 would be haunted by the battle for the rest of their lives. Commander Evans of the Johnston went down with his ship, last seen giving orders from the slanting deck as she capsized. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The crew of Samuel B. Roberts, who spent 2 days in the water fighting off sharks and dealing with horrific injuries, would hold reunions for decades, never forgetting the shipmates they lost. Admiral Sprague, asked how his outgunned force stopped the Japanese, would say simply, "By the grace of God." The ocean around Samar had turned into a killing field, so intense that rescue operations continued for days. American ships found survivors scattered across miles of water, some on rafts, some clinging to debris, many wounded, all traumatized. Japanese survivors, from ships sunk by submarines and air attacks, were also rescued, many expressing amazement at being treated humanely after the propaganda they had been taught. The tactical analyses began immediately. American naval officers studied the battle, trying to understand how Taffy 3 had survived, how Kurita had been stopped, why Halsey had been deceived so completely. The conclusions were sobering. The division of command between Halsey and Kincaid had nearly led to disaster. Only the extraordinary courage of Sprague's sailors had prevented catastrophe. Admiral Nimitz, reading the after-action reports, reportedly said, "The Japanese came closer to winning at Leyte Gulf than anyone wants to admit." For the Japanese, Leyte Gulf represented the death of a doctrine. Since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Japanese naval strategy had focused on the decisive battle, the one climactic engagement where superior training, tactics, and spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Leyte Gulf was supposed to be that battle. Japan had committed everything. The plan had been sound, the execution reasonably good, and they had still lost decisively. There would be no more plans for decisive battles, only desperate measures, suicide attacks, and the slow grinding defeat that industrial warfare made inevitable. The environmental cost of the battle was something no one considered at the time. 4 days of naval combat had dumped thousands of tons of fuel oil into the ocean. Ships burned and sank, taking their bunker fuel with them. The oil slicks spread across hundreds of square miles. Sailors in the water described swimming through oil, thick enough to choke on, coating their skin, burning their eyes. The oil fires, fed by fuel from damaged ships, created scenes from hell. Burning oil on water creates a peculiar horror. It spreads rapidly, ignited by the smallest spark. Sailors abandoning ship would jump into water that moments later would burst into flame. The fire followed the oil slicks, chasing survivors who had to swim underwater to escape the flames, surfacing in clear patches to gasp for air before diving again as the fire approached. The destroyer Johnston sank in flames, her oil spreading across the water and igniting. Survivors described swimming away from their ship through burning ocean, diving repeatedly to escape the heat, watching shipmates who couldn't dive fast enough or long enough catch fire and die screaming. Commander Hagen, executive officer of Johnston, survived by repeatedly diving beneath the flames, surfacing in clear patches, then diving again as fire approached. He spent 7 hours in the water before rescue, much of it diving to avoid flames. The carrier Gambia Bay, when she capsized, released thousands of gallons of aviation fuel from her bunkers and from aircraft in her hangar. The fuel spread quickly, a shimmering rainbow slick that covered acres of ocean surface. When shells from Japanese cruisers struck nearby, the sparks ignited the fuel. The men from Gambia Bay, already in the water, found themselves surrounded by walls of flame. Some survived by finding clear patches and staying there, treading water in spaces no larger than a room while fire burned around them. Others drowned deliberately, choosing to go under rather than burn. The survivors talk about it still, old men with tears describing friends who chose drowning over burning. The Battle of Surigao Strait created its own environmental catastrophe. When the battleship Yamashiro exploded and sank, her magazines detonating, she released not just oil but unexploded ammunition, depth charges and torpedoes. The secondary explosions continued for hours as ammunition cooked off in the heat of burning fuel. The strait, narrow and confined, became a channel of fire. The battleship Fuso, broken in half, burned through the night, both halves remaining afloat for hours, each section a massive torch visible for miles. Sailors from other Japanese ships described the horror of seeing their comrades burning, hearing their screams over the radio, being unable to help because American ships controlled the strait. American destroyers, after the battle, reported sailing through debris fields that stretched for miles. Bodies, wreckage, life rafts, unexploded ordnance, and always the oil. Thick, black, stinking bunker oil that coated everything, made rescue operations hazardous, and killed men who might otherwise have survived. Oil in the lungs, breathed in while swimming, caused pneumonia that killed days after rescue. Oil ingested while in the water caused internal burns and poisoning. The medical facilities on American ships were overwhelmed with oil-related injuries alongside the expected combat trauma. The psychological cost of Leyte Gulf extended far beyond the immediate survivors. Every American sailor in the Pacific learned what had happened at Samar. They learned that 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers had faced the most powerful battleships in the world and survived through courage alone. It became a touchstone, proof that American sailors could face any odds and prevail. But it also revealed how close they had come to disaster, how the enemy had nearly reached the landing beaches, how thousands of soldiers ashore had been minutes from being killed by battleship bombardment they couldn't answer. For the men at Leyte, the ground troops watching from the beaches, the battle was terrifying in a unique way. They heard it, but couldn't see it. The thunder of naval guns carried across miles of water. The flashes of explosions lit the horizon. Radio reports filtered through command channels describing desperate battles, enemy battleships approaching, carriers sinking. The soldiers knew that if the Japanese fleet broke through, if those battleships reached the landing beaches, there was nothing that could stop them. Artillery couldn't reach them. Infantry weapons were useless. Air support was engaged elsewhere. They would be helpless, pinned on beaches while 18-inch shells turned their positions into craters. Staff Sergeant David Kerr, 1st Cavalry Division, later wrote in his memoir, "We heard the guns all morning, constant thunder from over the horizon. We knew a big fight was happening, but we didn't know who was winning. Around 0900, word came through that enemy battleships had broken through, were heading for us. Orders came to dig in, prepare for naval bombardment. We dug frantically, knowing it wouldn't matter. You can't dig deep, enough to survive an 18-inch shell. We just dug because it was something to do besides wait to die. Then, around 1000, word came that the enemy had turned away. We didn't know why, didn't care. We just knew we were going to live." The Navy's investigation into the battle focused heavily on communication failures. Halsey hadn't known Kurita had turned back east until far too late. Kincaid had assumed Halsey was guarding San Bernardino Strait, because that seemed obvious tactically, but Halsey had never explicitly said so. The divided command structure meant no single authority could coordinate actions. Admiral Nimitz's report recommended major changes in command structure, better communication protocols and clearer definitions of responsibility. Many of these recommendations would be implemented, but too late for Leyte Gulf. The Japanese conducted their own investigation, though the conclusions were largely suppressed to avoid damaging morale. Admiral Kurita was heavily criticized for turning away at Samar when victory was in reach. He defended his decision, arguing that he believed he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers, and that pressing on would have resulted in the destruction of his entire force. His critics pointed out that his mission was to destroy the American landing force, even at the cost of his ships. That was the entire point of Operation Shogo. Kurita had prioritized ship survival over mission success, and in doing so had wasted Japan's last opportunity for a naval victory. Admiral Ozawa, whose sacrifice had worked perfectly, drawing Halsey north exactly as planned, received praise for his execution. That his success nearly led to American disaster at Samar was attributed to Kurita's failure to press home his attack, not to any flaw in Ozawa's actions. Ozawa survived the war, and in post-war interviews expressed respect for American carrier pilots, admiration for American industrial capacity, and resignation that Japan had never had a realistic chance of victory once American production reached full capacity. The technology deployed at Leyte Gulf represented the cutting edge of 1944 naval warfare. American radar, particularly the fire control radar on the battleship West Virginia, allowed accurate gunnery at ranges impossible in earlier wars. At the Battle of Surigao Strait, West Virginia scored hits on Yamashiro at over 22,000 yards, nearly 13 miles in darkness. The Japanese, lacking equivalent radar, were firing blind, relying on visual spotting that couldn't work at night or at extreme ranges. This technology gap, as much as any tactical factor, determined the outcome at Surigao Strait. American damage control, learned from hard experience at Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal, had reached a level of sophistication that amazed even American officers. The escort carrier Kalinin Bay took 13 8-inch shell hits at Samar, suffered fires and flooding, lost steering control and not only survived but remained operational. Her damage control teams controlled flooding, fought fires, and jury-rigged repairs that kept her functioning. A Japanese ship with similar damage would likely have sunk. The difference was training, equipment, and a damage control philosophy that emphasized saving ships rather than abandoning them. Japanese damage control had never recovered from losing so many experienced sailors at Midway and in the Solomons campaign. By 1944, Japanese ships were manned by increasingly inexperienced crews who lacked the training to effectively respond to damage. When Musashi was hit by torpedoes, her damage control team struggled to contain flooding, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked experience and equipment. American submarines had noticed the same thing. Japanese ships that would have survived damage earlier in the war were sinking by 1944 because the crews didn't know how to save them. The kamikaze attacks at Leyte Gulf opened a new and terrifying chapter in Pacific War. Japanese commanders had discovered a weapon that American technology couldn't completely defend against. Radar could detect incoming aircraft. Combat air patrol could intercept some attackers. Anti-aircraft guns could shoot down most. But some would always get through, and one aircraft crashing into a ship could sink it. The mathematics were brutally simple. Japan had thousands of aircraft. They had thousands of pilots, many poorly trained and unsuitable for conventional combat, but perfectly adequate for flying a plane into a ship. They had thousands of young men willing to die for the emperor. This was a weapon Japan could afford to use, and America couldn't completely stop. Admiral Halsey, reading the first kamikaze attack reports, understood immediately what this meant. He reportedly said, "The Japanese have figured out how to make their numerical weakness irrelevant. Every plane is a potential guided missile, every pilot a potential bomb. We can shoot down 90% of them, and the 10% that get through will still sink ships and kill sailors." The Navy began immediately developing counter-tactics, additional anti-aircraft guns, better radar, improved damage control, but the fundamental problem remained. You couldn't stop all of them, and the ones that got through were devastating. The kamikazes introduced a psychological element that conventional warfare lacked. Sailors could understand attacks by aircraft dropping bombs or torpedoes. The pilot was trying to complete a mission and return home. His survival instinct meant he would break off if the attack became too dangerous. But kamikazes were different. No amount of anti-aircraft fire would make them break off, because they were already committed to dying. In fact, heavy fire might make them more determined, eager to die doing maximum damage. This psychology was alien to American sailors, and defending against it required a mental adjustment that many found difficult. Post-war analysis by American psychologists studied the effects of kamikaze attacks on American sailor morale. They found that kamikaze attacks produced significantly higher rates of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown than conventional attacks, even when the conventional attacks caused more casualties. The deliberate suicide element created a stress that ordinary combat didn't. Sailors reported nightmares about aircraft that kept coming despite being shot to pieces, about pilots deliberately aiming their burning planes at American ships, about the moment of impact when a plane loaded with bombs and fuel crashed into the deck. Japanese pilots selected for kamikaze missions underwent brief training that focused entirely on flying the aircraft to the target. Advanced maneuvering, combat tactics, navigation skills beyond basic map reading, none of it mattered. The pilot needed to take off, find the American fleet, select a target, and crash into it. This required minimal flight training, allowing Japan to convert pilots with less than 50 hours of flight time into weapons. The Special Attack Corps, the official name for the kamikaze units, became Japan's main offensive weapon for the war's final year. The ethical debates about kamikaze tactics began even during the war. American officers struggled to understand how Japanese commanders could order young men to commit suicide. Japanese culture, with its emphasis on honor, duty, and sacrifice for the collective good, made the decision less alien to Japanese participants than it appeared to Americans. Many kamikaze pilots volunteered, seeing their deaths as meaningful sacrifice for their families and nation. Others were pressured, the social expectations making refusal nearly impossible. Post-war interviews with Japanese officers involved in organizing kamikaze attacks revealed ambivalence. Many expressed pride in the pilot's courage, while acknowledging the tragedy of wasting young lives in attacks that delayed but couldn't prevent defeat. The physical effects of kamikaze attacks were studied intensely by American naval architects. A Zero fighter, fully loaded with fuel and carrying a 500-pound bomb, represented roughly 3,000 pounds of aircraft, plus 1,000 pounds of explosives, crashing into a ship at over 300 miles per hour. The kinetic energy alone was equivalent to multiple heavy bomb hits. The aviation fuel, spreading through the ship and igniting, caused fires that were extremely difficult to control. The bomb, detonating inside the ship after the aircraft penetrated the deck, caused internal damage that external bomb hits couldn't match. The combination of kinetic impact, fire, and explosion made kamikaze attacks approximately 3 times as effective as conventional bombing per aircraft, according to Navy damage assessment studies. American ship design began changing in response to the kamikaze threat. Steel flight decks, already being installed on new carriers, proved much more resistant to kamikaze damage than wooden decks. British carriers, with their armoured flight decks, survived kamikaze hits that would have gutted American carriers with wooden decks. Additional anti-aircraft guns, particularly the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons, were mounted on every available space. Fire suppression systems were improved. Damage control training focused heavily on fighting aviation fuel fires. By 1945, American carriers were bristling with anti-aircraft weapons and incorporating design features specifically to resist kamikaze attacks. The strategic implications of Leyte Gulf extended beyond the immediate battle. Japan's loss of its naval power meant the Philippines could be retaken with minimal naval interference. The sea lanes between the home islands and the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia were now completely vulnerable to American submarines and aircraft. Japan's war industry, already struggling with material shortages, would receive almost no oil, rubber, or strategic metals from the occupied territories. The home islands would be slowly strangled, production dropping month by month as stockpiles were exhausted and not replaced. General MacArthur, watching the naval battle from his headquarters on Leyte, understood that the Navy's victory guaranteed his ground campaign success. Without Japanese naval interference, American supplies could flow freely to Leyte. Reinforcements could arrive without fear of interdiction. Air support from escort carriers and land-based aircraft could operate without worrying about Japanese battleships bombarding airfields. The campaign to liberate the Filipinas, MacArthur's promised return, could proceed on schedule. He sent a message to Admiral Kinkaid that read simply, "The Navy has done its job magnificently. The Army will do the same." The human stories from Leyte Gulf continued to emerge for decades after the battle. Survivors wrote memoirs, historians conducted interviews, veterans reunited at anniversaries. Each account added details to the massive mosaic of the battle. Chief Boatswain's mate William Brooks, who served on the destroyer Heermann during her torpedo attack at Samar, described the experience in a 1982 interview. "We were so close to the Japanese battleships I could see the faces of their sailors on deck. Their guns were firing at us, massive shells that made the ocean erupt when they missed. Our captain was maneuvering like crazy, dodging shells, launching torpedoes, firing our little 5-inch guns at ships that outweighed us by tens of thousands of tons. I thought we were dead. Every man on that ship thought we were dead, but we kept fighting because that's what you do. You fight until you can't fight anymore. Somehow we survived. I still don't know how." Lieutenant Robert Copeland, commanding officer of the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, survived the sinking of his ship and spent 2 days in the water before rescue. In post-war interviews, he spoke about the decision to attack the Japanese battleships. "I knew it was suicide. My officers knew it was suicide. The crew knew it. But we also knew what would happen if we didn't attack. Those escort carriers would be destroyed. The landing beaches would be bombarded. Thousands of soldiers would die. We had to attack, even knowing we wouldn't survive." That's the decision every captain in Taffy 3 made that morning. We charged battleships in tin cans because American boys on those beaches deserved every chance we could give them. The Japanese perspective on the battle emerged slowly in post-war years, as veterans published memoirs and historians gained access to Japanese records. Commander Tonosuke Otani, gunnery officer on the battleship Nagato during the battle, wrote in his 1970 memoir about the shock of the American destroyer attacks at Samar. "We were expecting easy victory. These were escort carriers, small destroyers, nothing that could threaten battleships. Then the American destroyers charged us. It was insane, suicide, but it was also the bravest thing I ever witnessed. They came straight at us, firing their inadequate guns, launching torpedoes from suicidal range. They forced our battleships to maneuver, disrupting our formations, preventing us from concentrating fire on the carriers. When we finally sank them, I felt no triumph. Only respect for their courage and shame that our attack failed against such determination." Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw at Samar remained controversial in Japan for decades. Some historians defended his choice, arguing he made the best decision with the information available. Others condemned him as defeatist, claiming he abandoned victory when it was within reach. Kurita himself, in rare interviews before his death in 1977, remained defensive about his decision. "I believed I was facing Halsey's fleet carriers. Every report suggested this. The ferocity of the air attacks, the aggressive destroyer tactics, everything pointed to fighting a superior force. I had already lost Musashi. My ships were low on fuel and ammunition. I made the decision I believed was correct to preserve my force. If I had known they were only escort carriers, yes, I would have pressed on. But I didn't know. I couldn't know." The strategic debate about Halsey's decision to chase Ozawa's carriers north continued for generations. Naval historians divided into Halsey's defenders and critics, each side marshalling evidence to support their position. The defenders argued that destroying the Japanese carrier force was the correct priority, that Halsey couldn't have known Kurita would press on after the Sibuyan Sea attacks, and that Taffy 3's survival proved the decision, while risky, was ultimately correct. The critics countered that basic tactical doctrine required guarding San Bernardino Strait, that Halsey's obsession with carriers blinded him to other threats, and that only luck and extraordinary courage prevented disaster. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report on the battle, carefully avoided directly criticizing Halsey while making clear that lessons needed to be learned. The division of command structure, the assumptions about enemy intentions, and the communication failures must be addressed. "We came closer to disaster than is comfortable to acknowledge. That we prevailed speaks to the courage and skill of our sailors, not to the perfection of our command decisions." This diplomatic language satisfied no one and guaranteed the debate would continue. The technological lessons from Leyte Gulf influenced American naval doctrine for decades. The effectiveness of radar-directed gunnery at Surigao Strait proved that technology could make night combat feasible in ways previously impossible. The Navy invested heavily in improving radar systems, developing better fire control computers, and training crews in radar-directed combat. The vulnerability of ships to kamikaze attacks drove development of better anti-aircraft systems, improved damage control procedures, and eventually guided missiles that could destroy aircraft at greater ranges than guns. The industrial lessons were equally significant. American production had replaced losses in days that would have taken Japan months or years to replace. This disparity, visible throughout the war but crystallized at Leyte Gulf, demonstrated that industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern warfare. The nation that could produce more ships, more aircraft, more ammunition, more of everything, would prevail regardless of tactical skill or strategic insight. This lesson would shape American military doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The environmental recovery from the battle took decades. The oil slicks dissipated slowly, killing fish and marine life, contaminating beaches across hundreds of miles of coastline. Unexploded ordnance from the battle continued to be found for years, occasionally exploding and killing fishermen. The wrecks of sunken ships, many containing fuel oil and ammunition, leaked pollution for decades. Modern environmental assessments have found that the wreck of Musashi, lying in over 3,000 feet of water, is still leaking small amounts of fuel oil 80 years after her sinking. The human recovery was equally slow. Veterans of Taffy 3 struggled with survivors' guilt, asking why they lived when so many shipmates died. Psychological counselling for combat trauma was primitive in the 1940s, leaving many veterans to cope alone with nightmares, anxiety, and depression. The reunion associations formed by survivors provided crucial support, giving veterans a space to share experiences with people who understood. The Samuel B. Roberts Survivors Association met annually for over 60 years, the membership dwindling each year but the bonds remaining strong. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the end of one era of naval warfare and the beginning of another. The battleship, dominant for centuries, had proven vulnerable to aircraft and suicide attacks in ways that made it obsolete. The carrier, already important, became the undisputed queen of the seas. The submarine, which had contributed critically to Japanese defeat through its campaign against merchant shipping, would become even more important in future wars, and the guided missile, prefigured by the kamikaze, would revolutionize naval combat in ways the 1944 combatants couldn't imagine. For the men who fought at Leyte Gulf, the battle remained the defining experience of their lives. They had witnessed the largest naval battle in history, fought in conditions of terror and confusion, seen courage and cowardice, victory and defeat, all compressed into 4 days of combat so intense that decades later they would wake from nightmares reliving it. They had seen the ocean turn to fire, had swum through burning fuel, had watched ships carrying friends explode and sink. They had also seen ordinary sailors perform extraordinary acts of courage, charging impossible odds, refusing to surrender, fighting on when any rational person would have quit. The final assessment of Leyte Gulf must acknowledge both the American victory and the Japanese sacrifice. The Americans won decisively, destroying Japanese naval power and opening the path to the home islands, but the Japanese fought courageously, executing a complex plan under impossible conditions, and came within minutes of achieving their objectives at Samar. The battle demonstrated both American industrial might and Japanese determination, the combination of overwhelming material superiority and desperate bravery that characterized the Pacific War's final year. When the last veteran of Leyte Gulf dies, the battle will pass from living memory into history. But the lessons remain relevant. Industrial capacity matters, command structure matters, communication matters. Technology provides advantages but doesn't guarantee victory. Courage can overcome impossible odds but can't defeat arithmetic. And in war, as in life, the most carefully laid plans encounter friction, chance, and human decision-making that makes outcomes uncertain until the final moment. The ocean around Leyte has long since absorbed the oil, scattered the wreckage, and returned to the tropical beauty that existed before 200,000 sailors fought the largest naval battle in history. The sunken ships remain, war graves marked on charts but largely undisturbed. The veterans are mostly gone now, their stories preserved in memoirs, oral histories, and official records. But the battle they fought continues to echo through naval history, a 4-day testament to courage, determination, industrial might, and the terrible cost of war. October 26, 1944. The guns had fallen silent, the fleets had withdrawn, the ocean, which had burned with fire and thunder for 4 days, was quiet except for the sound of rescue operations continuing to pull survivors from the water. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. Japan's navy was finished. America's path to Tokyo was open. And thousands of sailors, American and Japanese, would never come home. The ocean had turned to fire, and when the flames finally died, the Pacific War's outcome was no longer in doubt.